are listening to the Twin Cities Apologetics Podcast, recorded from the studio of OAC Technology, who provides helpful IT support for businesses. This podcast equips followers of Jesus with apologetics resources to strengthen their faith and build them up as ambassadors for Christ. We hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Twin Cities Apologetics Podcast. I'm Jeremy Linn, your host, and we are a ministry that meets every other week in Hopkins, Minnesota, to cover important apologetics content in discussion. If you're around that area in Minnesota, feel free to join us. You can go to twincitiesapologetics.com for more information, or go to our Facebook group specifically for those events. So I have a guest here, David Clark. David, thanks for joining me tonight.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. And it's kind of an interesting dynamic we have here because I'm actually a student of yours right now in a class. And we covered in a previous class this topic that we're going through tonight.
Right.
So I think that'll be cool for me to kind of refresh my memory on those things and also learn personally along with the people watching here.
Sure, you bet.
So, David, can you give us a little background about your history in apologetics and what that looks like, how you got interested in it, and then your path in God using you in that way with apologetics?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that. Well, of course, the beginning is one's own personal journey of faith, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to have an understanding of your own faith and have a sense of rational defense or reasonable foundation for what you believe. Mm-hmm. And so my beginnings, I think, in apologetics were really about my own faith. I took a course on that in college. I wouldn't say that was a very satisfying course. I actually left with more dissatisfaction and questions from that particular class. Mm-hmm. But it led me to study academically the area of philosophy of religion. Now, philosophy of religion and apologetics aren't exactly the same, mm-hmm. but philosophy of religion is one of the things that you could say feeds into the practice of apologetics.
Right.
And so over the years, as I've taught philosophy and theology, really for several decades, apologetics is right there in that mix. And I now teach courses in apologetics as well as courses in specific subtopics. Mm-hmm. And of course, the problem of evil, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, is an important subtopic in apologetics. And it's certainly something that I'm interested in personally, have thought a lot about, have struggled with in terms of my own journey. But also have helped others with along the way. So That's been my journey.
Yeah, cool. Right. So, David, tell me about this area of the problem of evil and suffering that we're going to talk about tonight. How would you describe that problem in, say, a minute? If someone asked you what that was all about, what would you tell them?
Sure. The intellectual problem of evil is a classic problem that goes back thousands of years. Mm-hmm. The ancient Greeks talked about this. All the philosophers and theologians through the Middle Ages and up through the modern period of philosophy discussed it as well. And it's quite simple. It's this idea that the existence of evil counts as evidence against the existence of God. Mm-hmm. So classically, people would say that you Christians, or people who believe in God more generally, believe that God is almighty. If God is almighty, he should be able to get rid of all the evil in the world, mm-hmm. because almightiness means that God is able to do anything. If God is good, then he should want to get rid of evil, because a God who is good should be like human beings who are good. We're good people in some respects, not completely, but we have a desire to help other people, to keep other people from experiencing harm and suffering. And so if you're good, you should want to get rid of evil. Mm-hmm. So if God is almighty and God is all good, he should be able and should desire to get rid of all evil and all suffering. But the reality is that there's suffering and evil in the world. Mm-hmm. And so that means either God is not all good, as you Christians say, or God is not almighty, as you Christians say, or more likely, an atheist would say, God doesn't exist at all. So that's the essence of the intellectual problem of evil. It's a 2,000-plus-year-old problem, and people have talked about it in different formats, but that's the heart of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a very difficult problem because you're kind of talking about the intellectual side of it, but it's something that we experience in our daily lives sometimes, or just in our lives in general.
Absolutely.
So it really touches to the heart in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I like to distinguish between the problem of evil mm-hmm. and the problem of suffering.
Right.
So the problem of evil is more this intellectual question of how do the ideas fit together, or do they fit together, mm-hmm. And then the problem of suffering, though, is this experiential aspect of things. It's how do we engage the fact that in our lives we experience suffering, loss, pain, and how do we find the resources that we need to overcome or to cope with these difficult things that happen in our lives.
David, so on that note, we've talked about this issue before, the problem of suffering.
Right.
And you actually have a personal story on this issue regarding a friend of yours that went through an experience of suffering and went a particular path as a result of that. So can you explain that story a little bit to us?
Yeah, you bet. This is someone else's story to tell, but this is a story of a person who was really, in his own mind, thinking that he might eventually become a pastor. So he wanted to go to seminary. He wanted to learn about how he could help others. And yet he had personally experienced real suffering. So that personal experience of suffering caused him to experience a real doubt about faith. So he went to a faculty member who was a theologian, actually, and he said, I've got this problem. I'm struggling with the intellectual question of how I can believe in God, and yet I've also experienced this personal suffering. How do I put that together? And this professor said to him, listen, don't worry about that problem. You shouldn't be thinking about that. Just have faith in God, just believe, and don't worry about it. And eventually, God will help you to overcome the suffering in your life. Unfortunately, that response was very unsatisfying to this friend, and it would have been very unsatisfying to me as well. I can certainly resonate with my friend in that. And eventually, he decided that he just couldn't be a pastor, and then after even more time passed, he actually gave up his faith and became an atheist. So I find that to be a very troubling kind of story because it says that the inability or unwillingness to provide an intellectual response actually did harm to this person's faith. I find it inexcusable that a Christian minister would do something like that.
Right. And it's hard, too, because that's a situation you can't control.
Right.
You can't control how someone responds verbally to someone going through suffering.
Yeah.
So you had, of course, interactions with your friends
right.
over this time and over time. So what was your kind of reaction to his situation, his path, and how did you interact with him over that time?
I think a piece of this immediately is to make sure that you are connecting at a human level regarding the suffering side of it.
Yeah.
And this is something that I had to learn myself because initially, as I approached this thing, I approached it purely from a perspective of here are all the ideas. How do they fit together logically? How should we define our terms? What are the principles involved? And I didn't really pay attention to empathy, to human care, to the emotional, relational, and spiritual side of things. I think the first thing to do in connecting with a person who is experiencing suffering is to empathize with them. Now, that doesn't mean that you take on their suffering or that you sort of join them in their suffering. But I think you say something like this. I think, the right perspective is to say, I have not suffered what you're suffering. I have suffered in different ways, and I know that's painful, and I'm very sorry for that, and I feel with you, and I will experience with you your pain, even though your suffering and my suffering are different.
Right.
I think, for instance, I've heard males say to females who have experienced something that's, say, only females can experience, like the loss of a baby, let's say, and they will say something like, I know exactly how you feel, which is ridiculous. They don't know exactly how a person of the opposite gender would feel.
Right.
So I haven't experienced your suffering, but I have experienced my own suffering, and I am sorry for yours, and I am with you in that. That kind of sort of human response of connection, of support, of empathy, I think is the first place to begin. And sometimes those words have to be preceded by just a period of silence and of presence and of a sense of non-anxiousness. We can't get sort of freaked out by the fact that another person is experiencing that pain, but simply to be present with them and to express your empathy with them. Those are good things to do at the beginning, especially in that early phase as a person is sort of in that white-hot moment of suffering.
Yeah.
Now, that said, I think later on, eventually, you do have to come back to think intellectually and theologically about evil. But you don't do that right out of the chute in that first moment when a person is experiencing suffering.
So you would say that you didn't necessarily respond in the best way initially with your friend?
Well, as I understood this friend's experience, it was some years back that he had actually experienced the suffering.
Okay, I see.
Right. So when we got together, he told me this story as part of him explaining to me why it was that for him, the problem of evil was the most important reason why he chose not to be a believer in God. Mm-hmm. So he was telling me his story, and this had happened a couple decades back. And at this point, at the time we were talking, he'd become pretty solidified in his atheism. I still think at that point that it was appropriate for me, and I did because of past experiences. I'd done it badly in other cases, but in this case, I immediately said to him, I'm very sorry that happened. I understand the pain and the suffering involved in that, and I regret that very much. Mm-hmm. I also regret that there wasn't a person who had an appropriate response to your question in the moment that you needed that. Mm-hmm. And I'm very sorry for that. He said, well, it's fine. That was 20 years ago and it's not a problem anymore. So he had emotionally, overcome that in a different way.
Right.
So having connected at, I think, a personal level, and we are human beings and we want to connect and experience appropriate kinds of intimacy with other human beings at a human level. So having done that as part of our friendship, we also then turned our attention to the intellectual question and had a robust conversation about that as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's a great time to kind of turn to that side of things, the intellectual side of the problem of evil and suffering. And with what you're talking about before with that pastor and his response to your friend, it really shows the need, it seems to me, to have an appropriate response to this question from an intellectual standpoint.
Right.
Your friend certainly was going through emotional things at the time in difficulties, but there was also the intellectual side tied into it because he wanted to have that answer at the time.
Right.
And no one was apparently able to provide that. Mm-hmm. And who knows what effect that had on him at that time.
Right.
So turning now to the intellectual side, what would you say, maybe with conversations with your friends or in other situations, what would you say is the most difficult aspect of the intellectual problem of evil that you've come across before?
Well, that's a great question. The intellectual problem of evil has a lot of different aspects to it, of course. But if you ask what is the most difficult part of it, for me, I think the most difficult part is the idea that, according to the teachings of Jesus, evil in terms of separation from God is something that will be eternal for those who reject God. Mm-hmm. And I find that to be the intellectually most difficult thing. It's really the problem of hell. Mm-hmm. Is there an experience that people experience that involves separation from God that is really sort of a punishment for their sin that is never going to end? It's eternal. I find that to be very, very challenging. Now, I think, first of all, you have to say right away that the experience of hell that we're talking about here has very little to do with, people wearing red pajamas and carrying pitchforks and having little masks with horns on. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of imagery like that has grown up over time that is not the issue. But I do think that this notion that someone could be separated from God, for eternity is a tough problem to resolve.
Mm-hmm. So, with that difficult issue, because let's say someone asked me that question, I would immediately recognize that as a hard question to respond to.
Sure.
So with that in mind, what would be maybe one of your initial responses to someone saying this? We can't really have a long conversation that might result from a question like that, but what would your basically initial response be to that point?
Right. So if we needed to talk about this in a brief fashion, I think I would emphasize the idea that God respects who we are as persons. He's created human beings. The Bible says He's created us in His image. That means in some way we reflect the character and being of God. Mm-hmm. I think that image includes this idea of freedom. And when we act freely in a way that goes contrary to God's will, God does not sort of override that freedom and force us to do the right thing at all times. In fact, He respects our freedom even when we do it wrongly.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that's a very, very central aspect of the intellectual response, is this notion that God has given freedom, that freedom is essential to love relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So if one person forces another person to love, we don't call that love, we call that rape. If some person purchases the love of another person, we don't call that love, we call that prostitution. Real love has to be given out of the deep freedom of a person's spirit. Mm-hmm. God gives us that gift of freedom because that's necessary to love, and love is the thing that he wants more than anything else. He wants to enjoy a love relationship with us and to invite us into a love relationship with him. Mm-hmm. So he respects that freedom. And when we abuse it, he respects that as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think the key of the answer to something like evil generally, but particularly to even eternal evil or eternal suffering, is the fact that this is part of God respecting who we are as persons. And I think there's some real positive reflections around what it means to say that even God respects the fact that I have chosen a particular life, and does not override my freedom in a paternalistic kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the people objecting to God, let's say, would be angry at God forcing that person to do something, most likely.
It's plausible to think that a person might say, if God were in a position to say, I'm going to give you freedom, but only if you use it in the right way. If not, I'm going to take it away. I do think that would be something that a person would object to. I would object to that. And I would imagine as well that a person who doesn't believe in God would find that kind of a picture of God's behavior to be very troubling. And as you say, might even cause anger against God.
Yeah. So to try to summarize what you've explained with this question of hell, basically, what you're saying is God has given people the free will to be in a relationship or choose to be in a relationship with God, or to not choose that.
Right.
And the result of the not choosing is basically hell. However, we would see the details of that working out. Right.
So there are metaphors that describe what hell is like, and we don't want to get hung up on those metaphors. I think the essence of it, according to the teaching of the Bible, is that hell is being separated from God. And so if we refuse to be in God's presence, God says, okay, I will grant you your desire, your choice, which is to be separated from me. I find C.S. Lewis particularly helpful on this. He says that hell is not the place where God grabs a bad person, throws them in prison, and slams the door on the prison cell, but rather hell is a place where somebody who refuses to be in God's presence, wants to live their own way, where that person can go and hide from God and slam the door to keep God out. And so he says, I think very helpfully, the gate of hell is locked on the inside, not the outside.
Right.
The gate of hell keeps God out. It doesn't keep the person away from God. And that, I think, is a helpful way for me to understand how it is that a person could be separated from God.
All right, we're going to take a short break, and we'll come back with one more intellectual consideration of the problem of evil, and then also turn to the emotional side, which is so important with this topic.
You bet. That sounds great.
All right, we'll be right back.
Did you know 75% of young people leave the church upon entering college? How can we keep our young people engaged with the church and with the Christian worldview? This is where Rethink 2019 comes in, an exciting student apologetics conference coming to Minneapolis this November. There, top apologetics speakers will train young people to address the challenges to faith they will face as they move into college and beyond. For more information about this conference put on by Stand to Reason, check out the events section of our website, TwinCitiesApologetics.com. That's TwinCitiesApologetics.com.
Welcome back to the Twin Cities Apologetics Podcast. I'm Jeremy Linn with my guest, David Park. So David, we just talked about one intellectual aspect of the problem of evil and suffering, basically the problem of hell. Almost like a separate issue in a sense, but definitely related. So I'm wondering, we're kind of talking about the end, eternity, essentially, with the problem of hell. I want to talk about another side of the intellectual problem that people bring up a lot. And that's kind of the beginning. Basically, why would God create a world in which he knew suffering would take place?
and that children would have cancer and things like that. What would your initial response be to someone who brings up that objection?
The concept that God knows that evil is going to come is over against or balanced out by the fact that God also knows that there's a lot of good in the world. Mm-hmm. And so, there is this idea that there's a greater good that overrides or creates at least a justification for allowing a lesser evil. Now, it's very difficult for us because we don't have all knowledge to understand, what's the total amount of good, the total amount of evil, qualitatively and quantitatively. I mean, there's a lot we don't know. Mm-hmm. But certainly, if God is desiring that there be a greater good that he will produce along the way, then God has to be making a judgment that it is justified to experience some pain in order to achieve that greater good. Mm-hmm. I've had knee surgery. I remember the day after my surgery, my knee hurt like crazy. I could not believe the pain. I told my wife that I was quite certain that this was pain greater than what she experienced when she gave birth. She absolutely denied that I was right on that point, and of course she's probably right. But nevertheless, my knee hurt a lot. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I knew that because I had gone through this experience, there was going to be a greater good coming down the line. And so as much as I didn't enjoy that, I also was able to understand that it was, in the total scheme of things, a good thing. Now, you might say, why doesn't God look at all the possible worlds and create the one in which all the goods that he wants to achieve could be produced, mm-hmm. but with lesser evil? And, that's an imponderable kind of question, because it would take a supercomputer to figure that all out. And for us as human beings, we, again, don't really know whether such a world even exists.
Right.
And so, we have to acknowledge that there are a lot of open-ended questions here that we can't really put specific details to, just because the amount of good and evil in the world is so great, it overwhelms our capacity to make judgments. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, if we start with what we know about God, namely that he is a good God who wants to achieve what is good, who wants to bring us to personal relationships of love and intimacy with others and with himself, then we have to believe that he is working things out in such a way that the amount of evil that we experience in our world is justified by some greater, or is possibly justified by greater goods in the end. Mm-hmm. So that's at least a partial response that acknowledges the areas that we don't know, but also tries to make some positive hay out of the things that we do know. And I think in this area, it's always wise for us to start with what we know, mm-hmm. rather than to start with what we don't know and then just allow that to multiply.
Right.
Like any exercise, you start with what you know and then you build out from there. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, probably what we have to do with this problem of evil.
Yeah, and that might be a good conversation to have, let's say, with a skeptic that you're talking about with this problem, where they say, oh, there's no way God could exist with all of this suffering, or it's very unlikely that God exists. Well, what are the calculations to kind of show that, or how does this one know that that's the case? There are so many factors out there involved in the whole issue. It's really hard to hone down how someone can know such a thing.
It is true, and we can't know, on the other hand, exactly what God is doing or how God is making these calculations or how God weighs all of this. Mm-hmm. So in a way, we have to acknowledge, whether we're a Christian or a non-Christian, whether we are a theist or an atheist, we have to acknowledge that this gets us into an area where there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And for us to say for sure that we know this, that this proves God doesn't exist, or to say for sure that we know this is exactly what God is up to on the positive side, mm-hmm. Both of those are probably implying more knowledge than we're able to nail down.
Yeah, so that's a challenge for Christians, too, to not overstate our case.
Correct.
When talking about this issue. And also kind of connects all of us together, that we do experience suffering on a personal level and really don't know all the different components of where it comes from and why, and all the different things that we can ask.
I think that's a very good caution. And, wisdom says that we shouldn't overstate our case. I know that sometimes when people respond to others who are experiencing difficult suffering, they feel some anxiety themselves about the fact that this other person is suffering. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit like the experience of coming upon an accident scene and seeing some people who are badly injured. And if you're not a medic or a physician or a nurse, you're just somebody who does something else for a living, it's very easy to get very, very nervous and anxious about what you're seeing in front of you. Mm-hmm. Similarly, when somebody experiences a lot of suffering, it's not uncommon for the other person to get very anxious about that, and so they try to speak with eternal truths in order to try to calm themselves down.
Yeah.
And it actually ends up not being very helpful to the other person.
Right.
So it really is wise for us to say, this is what we know, but not to claim knowledge in areas where we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm thinking back to your friend in that story that you gave, where he went through this experience of suffering and talked to someone about the intellectual side and didn't get a good response. And then emotionally, he was kind of wrapped up in that, and that led him down a path to rejecting God.
Right.
Where eventually the emotional thing wasn't there anymore, but the intellectual side was still something that needs to be discussed.
Right.
So with that story in mind, what is your big takeaway from that experience after seeing your friend kind of go through that and that path for Christians in their interactions with people experiencing suffering?
I would say a couple things. One thing I would say is I do think it is wise to really ask the question to yourself, is this person struggling more from an emotional perspective, or is this person more doubting from an intellectual perspective? Mm-hmm. This is kind of a diagnostic, and it's smart to get a sense of where this person is if you're going to be helpful. And so that can come from observation. It can come from asking very, very open-ended questions. But it is not very helpful to answer an emotional struggle with a highly intellectualized question. Mm-hmm. With a highly intellectualized answer.
Right.
And similarly, it's not very helpful to respond to an intellectual doubt with primarily a sympathetic or emotional or spiritual kind of response. Mm-hmm. So we want to line up the right kind of response with the right kind of challenge or the right kind of debate or question or struggle. Another thing that I think is really helpful to know is that simply being present with another person can be enormously helpful. Mm-hmm. We often feel sort of under pressure to come up with some brilliant response of some sort. Mm-hmm. And I would just like to say, don't feel that pressure. Just the fact that you're willing to sit with a person that is experiencing either doubts or some kind of suffering, that alone has tremendous benefit. We find that a person who's willing to engage in the conversation without necessarily feeling the pressure of being the answer person can still provide a tremendous amount of benefit as the person who is suffering processes what they're experiencing. Mm-hmm. So presence is a very, very important and very powerful aspect of responding to the problem of suffering. And I think presence over time. And so many times, they talk about the stages of grief. Immediately after there's an experience of loss, people are much more in an emotional state. Mm-hmm. And then as time passes, they're able to sort of distance themselves a bit from the emotion, and they can begin to think or process a little bit more what they experienced.
Right.
And so, you need to walk with that person through those stages as well, mm-hmm. Responding emotionally and relationally and just by presence and comfort and love, by meeting needs, right at the beginning, and then having more biblical, theological, apologetic kinds of conversations down the line as that person begins to process it on that level.
Yeah.
So those are maybe three takeaways that I think are helpful as we think about how it is that we could respond to others who are experiencing suffering.
Yeah, it seems like there's kind of a balance in place here where we need to have the intellectual response or have a intellectual response to the problem of suffering and evil for people who need that response, especially someone in leadership like the pastor who you mentioned earlier.
Right.
As a Christian, I would hope for Christians in leadership to have basically a better intellectual response to something like that of such importance. But at the same time, we will need to feel like we have to give the exact right response in every moment to someone going through suffering, especially when they're going through something very emotional, and an intellectual response, like you said, won't necessarily help. Even if we have the exact right intellectual response, it doesn't mean it's the exact right thing to do.
Right, and it may not be the right response to that person. But part of this is that there can be a variety of reasons why people can experience suffering.
Yeah.
And people need to come to an understanding of what that is on their own. So if I say, I know why you're suffering, this is the answer, that's not nearly as helpful as just processing with a person.
Yeah.
Now, even if I have some ideas about what meaning can come out of that suffering for that person, I still want to pose it in the form of kind of a question. So I might say something like, it's been 2 years since your son committed suicide, and I just thought I would check back with you to see how it's going. And this is actually something I've experienced in the past. And the person says, I really appreciate that you're checking in with me.
Yeah.
And I say, yeah, I know it's got to be hard on the anniversary. And they say, yeah, it is. Because, when the day comes, that reminds me of what I experienced 2 years ago. And then maybe a question. So how are you processing what you've experienced?
Yeah.
And then that gives the person a chance to sort of pick from a variety of possible meanings, what this means to them. Have you found, any of the other kids that your son knew? Have you found any of them maybe turning back to God as a result of this? Or have you found any positive benefits that have come out of this? And often a person will tell us stories like, this was really, really painful. And I wouldn't wish this on anyone, but I'm really grateful that through this story, this other person experienced this kind of, redemption or renewal. Or it's brought our family back together because we suffered together over this pain when we were separated before. And you don't want to tell them that, but if you can ask an open-ended question that allows them to say, that was really painful, and also I can see God at work bringing good out of that pain.
Yeah.
That's a really helpful thing.
Yeah, and that's really bringing biblical truth into that conversation, because not only do we all have the experience of suffering, but the biblical truth is there can be some good that comes as a result of suffering.
Right.
So I think that's a great thing to ask about in that conversation.
Yeah, and it is an ask, right? It's a question, because there may be some good that comes out of that, but the person may still be too much in pain, suffering is too deep, and they may not be able to even notice it or appreciate it at that point.
Right.
So you don't force that. You just say, I understand. And that means maybe a year later or at some other time, they'll be able to come back to this. But
yeah, exactly.
At least you can pose the question and get them start to think about the possibility that God might be at work even though the pain is deep.
Yeah, absolutely. So believe it or not, we're at the end of our time here, and this has gone incredibly fast. I feel like we could talk about this topic for, a couple more hours.
It's a big, big topic, isn't it?
It really is, yeah, and there's so many sides that we haven't hit. But there's a lot of resources out there from Christian apologists writing about this topic, and we watched a video in our meeting last night from Ravi Zacharias responding to this issue, and there's a lot of great things on the intellectual end out there. But I think the most important thing to talk about really is the emotional response, or just basically what it looks like to be there with someone in their times of suffering. So thanks for coming today, David. I'm wondering, you have some books out there, I know, in apologetics. Could you kind of describe some of those resources that people can check out?
You bet. So I've not written specifically about the problem of evil, although I think it's obviously a very important one. But I teach classes on these materials at Bethel Seminary. You're a student there.
Yeah.
And certainly we'd encourage others to check that out as a possibility. Some of the books that I've written on apologetics have to do with worldview kinds of issues. So there's one called Apologetics in the New Age, in which we talk about various forms of pantheism and the challenge that pantheism has in dealing with the problem of evil. So what that points out is that Christian theism has to answer the problem of evil, but so does every other worldview. This is not just a problem for Christians who believe in God. It's a problem for any worldview. If you're an atheist, you still have to respond in some way to the fact that life will throw suffering into our experience.
Right.
And so, it's helpful to understand that as well.
Yeah, and maybe a topic for another podcast sometime.
You bet. So, we'll be glad to do that.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thanks again for coming, David, and we will see you next time.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed being here today.
Absolutely.